Life in Jericho, 3,000 years before Jesus, was the pinnacle of civilization in the Holy Land, a place of rich commerce and military protection. Many people today feel sorry for those ancients for not having hospitals or technology. But the truth is exactly the opposite. If a resident of Jericho saw us today, he would be shocked by our fragility. Today, you will understand why we are incapable of surviving where they thrived for millennia. First, you need to understand where we're standing. Forget the air conditioning. Jericho sits in a geographical hole, well below sea level. This means the place works like a pressure cooker. The heat here isn't just uncomfortable. It's dangerous. In summer, hitting 40 or 50 degrees is normal. Your only defense is shade and water. And that's where the danger lies. You see that water source bubbling up from the ground, the famous spring the Bible mentions, and it looks crystal clear, beautiful. But for your modern stomach, that's a time bomb. There was no filter, chlorine, or sewage treatment. The water that gave life to the city also carried invisible things: parasites, worms, bacteria. Today, if you have a stomachache, you take medicine and that's it. Back then, a severe intestinal infection killed. It dehydrated you in days. The impossibility of living there today starts here. Your body doesn't have the defenses they had. And there's another strange thing. When you walk through the mud streets, you feel the ground is uneven, high. Know why? Because you're literally walking on top of rubble. Jericho was destroyed and rebuilt so many times that the new city stood on top of the old one. You live, sleep, and eat on layers of broken houses and ancient stories. It's what we call a tell, an artificial hill made of ruins. But look, the suffocating heat and dirty water were problems everyone faced. The real problem, the one that kept people awake at night, was different. Water was scarce, and the city was full. And whoever controlled the tap controlled who lived and who died. 4,500 liters per minute. That's what the city's main spring spits from the earth every day, non-stop, for millennia. In the middle of a dry, dusty desert, seeing this amount of water bubbling up seems like a divine miracle. But in practice, loose water doesn't generate life. It generates mud and swamp. To turn this marsh into food, someone needed to design a complex system of channels, dikes, and floodgates to take each drop exactly where it was needed. And here, engineering becomes a political weapon. Think about it. If your barley plantation is at the end of the channel, you depend entirely on the goodwill of whoever controls the gate at the beginning. Near the spring, if you irritate the water administrator or refuse to pay the taxes of the time, the water stops coming. Your harvest dies in days, and your family goes hungry. There was no small claims court to complain. The social hierarchy in Jericho wasn't based on who had more gold, but on who was closest to the source. But keeping this system running had a brutal human cost. These channels filled with sludge, the edges collapsed, and new ditches needed to be opened under that 40-degree sun I mentioned before. Who did this dirty work? It was hardly the nobles. Inscriptions from neighboring peoples of the same era, like the famous Mesha Stele, proudly tell how kings used Israelite prisoners of war to dig trenches and channels. It's very likely that the water that kept Jericho alive ran through ditches dug by men who would rather be dead than continue that forced labor. This total dependence on engineering created terrible fragility. The city was an island of food surrounded by hunger, but it was an artificial island. If an enemy army managed to block the spring's outlet or poison the main channels, Jericho would surrender in a matter of days, without needing a single sword fight. The city's greatest strength was also its most obvious weak point. They built an incredible hydraulic system to dominate nature, but ended up becoming hostages of their own creation. To protect this liquid wealth and the food stocks it generated, they needed a physical barrier, something to prevent desperate nomads and rival armies from entering and taking everything. This is where the most famous image everyone has in mind about Jericho comes in. You're probably imagining gigantic walls, towers touching the sky, and soldiers patrolling the top. But the archaeology of the Iron Age shows something that goes against everything you learned in Sunday school or saw in Hollywood movies. If you looked for the giant walls you saw in biblical cartoons at this exact time, you would find only dust and broken stones. Those legendary fortifications that seemed to touch the sky belonged to an earlier era, the Bronze Age, and had already collapsed hundreds of years before you were born. Living in Jericho around the year 1000 before Christ meant walking among architectural ghosts, looking at the remains of a greatness that no longer existed. This created a serious psychological problem. The city didn't have that impenetrable shield that fame suggested. It was much more vulnerable, almost exposed. And to make matters worse, there was the spiritual weight of the place. There was an ancient curse recorded in the book of Joshua that promised death and misfortune to anyone who tried to rebuild those gates and fortified walls. Living there required a courage that bordered on madness. You were occupying marked territory, defying a divine sentence in exchange for that precious water I mentioned. So how did a city without the great walls of the past protect itself in a region infested with enemies? The solution was desperate and ingenious. The houses weren't just places to live, they were the barrier itself. The buildings on the edge of the city were made stuck together, forming a continuous ring of brick and mortar. The back wall of your room didn't open to a backyard, it opened to the open and dangerous desert. This completely changes the feeling of security. When you went to sleep, the only thing separating your family from an invading army or a band of looters was a sun-dried mud wall, maybe 30 or 40 centimeters thick. If someone made a hole in your living room, the entire city would be invaded. The responsibility of defense wasn't just the king's or the soldiers, it was domestic. Your house was the shield of all your neighbors. This survival architecture turned every night noise into panic. If a dog barked outside, you didn't know if it was just a lost animal or the beginning of a massacre. And archaeology confirms that this fear wasn't paranoia. When we excavate the floor of these houses, we find evidence that war didn't stop at the walls. It came through the front door, and the tools used to kill weren't what you'd expect to find on a battlefield, but objects you have in your kitchen. I'm going to reveal to you soon the true geographical meaning behind this epic event. But first, click the subscribe button to continue exploring the mysteries of Scripture with us. Ceramic pots full of burnt grains tell a frightening story. When sifting through what's left of the pantries of these houses, bronze arrowheads and sling stones mixed with the family's food often appear. This isn't an organization accident. This is a clear sign that when the attack began, there was no time to run to an arsenal or call the city guard. Defense needed to be within arm's reach, in the middle of preparing dinner. Jericho was an island of plenty surrounded by starving nomadic tribes. For those living in the desert, looking at those date palms and irrigated fields didn't generate admiration. It generated envy and desperation. The biblical account from the time of Judges shows this dynamic of constant invasions well, where entire groups entered to loot the harvest at harvest time. War wasn't an event with a set date on an open field. It was a street fight, dirty and quick to steal what you had planted. And don't expect to see shiny iron swords in everyone's hands. Iron was a new technology, expensive and rare in that region, that few could afford. Most people defended their homes with what they had, using short bronze daggers that lost their edge easily, stone axes, or sharpened agricultural tools. Violence was physical, brutal, and extremely close. If an invader passed through the door, the fight happened in the room where the children slept, using grain-grinding pestles as crushing weapons if necessary. Living like this created a state of permanent alert, a stress that never went down. Every shadow on the horizon could be a group of looters coming to take your entire year's sustenance. But curiously, arrows and spears were the type of threat you could at least see coming and try to block. The next enemy was much more cruel because it already lived inside the city, invisible, lodged in people's bodies, and today would be solved with a simple visit to the pharmacy. Imagine having a stomachache that never goes away. Not for a day or a week, but for years on end. The analysis of ancient latrines found in the region of Israel reveals a disgusting truth that biblical movies never show. Almost everyone, from the richest priest to the poorest servant, carried unwanted passengers in their intestines. Worms and parasites like giardia and tapeworm weren't a rare exception, they were the rule. You ate your hard-earned bread, but you weren't feeding just yourself. These parasites stole the few nutrients you managed to ingest, leaving the entire population in a chronic state of anemia, weakness, and exhaustion. Now, add physical pain to this permanent tiredness. If you broke a leg falling from a roof or had a tooth infection, there was no morphine, anesthesia, or clean surgery. You simply had to endure it. An inflamed tooth, something we solve in an hour in the dentist's chair today, could spread the infection to the jaw and kill an adult person in the midst of agonizing fever. Tolerance for pain needed to be from another world. Living in Jericho meant continuing to work and care for the family, while your body screamed in pain. Because if you stopped to rest, the food ran out. But the hardest blow wasn't to your own body. It was seeing what happened to the children. In a world without antibiotics and without basic hygiene notions, a simple fever or a cut on the foot could become fatal in a matter of days. It's estimated that almost half of the children didn't reach adulthood. Every family in that city knew the specific weight of a small, lifeless body. Parents didn't love their children any less than we love today, but they were forced to create a thick shell on their soul to be able to get out of bed the next day after a burial and continue life. If you're grateful for the health and protection we have access to today, comment down below. My life is a miracle. Surviving childhood was a biological lottery. But if you were lucky enough to escape the parasites, infections, and deadly fevers, you weren't free. You were just ready for the next stage of punishment. Because having health in Jericho meant only that you were fit to be ground down by work. The bones found in the ruins reveal that the daily routine didn't just tire people, it permanently and frighteningly deformed their skeleton. Start by observing the knees and spine of female skeletons from that era. They tell a story of slow and silent torture. The lower vertebrae are crushed, and the toes are permanently curved upward, locked in a position of tension. This isn't the result of a war or a rare genetic disease, it's the direct result of making lunch. To eat bread in Jericho, someone needed to make it from scratch, and that was brutal physical work. There were no mills powered by wind or water at that time. The available technology was a large concave stone on the ground and a smaller stone in hand. Women spent between 4 to 6 hours a day. Every day, kneeling on the hard ground, pushing their body weight back and forth to crush wheat against the rock. This back and forth movement, repeated thousands of times a week for decades, destroyed the joints. The price of not starving was sacrificing your own physical integrity. The human body was the machine, and that machine broke fast. But the suffering didn't end when the bread finally came out of the oven hot. The process of grinding stone against stone inevitably released fine sand, a basalt or limestone powder that mixed with the flour. You couldn't see it, but it was there. Therefore, every piece of bread that the inhabitants of Jericho chewed functioned like coarse sandpaper inside the mouth. The skulls of adults found in the region show teeth filed down to the root, with the pulp exposed. Eating was a painful act. The basic diet, which should keep a person alive, was literally wearing down the body from the inside with each meal. There was no weekend, holiday, or sick leave. If you woke up sick, with that fever caused by water parasites, you still needed to get up and grind the grain. If you stopped, the family didn't eat at night. Food anxiety was perpetual. They built an entire life based on this repetitive effort and resistance to pain, raising thick walls of raw brick to try to create a safe and stable home. The problem is that all this effort to build solid and heavy houses ignored an invisible and terrifying geological detail. They were trying to establish themselves in exactly the worst possible place on the planet to build anything made of clay. The city of Jericho sits exactly on top of a giant geological scar. The Jordan Valley isn't just a hot hole. It's an active seismic fault zone, the meeting point of two tectonic plates that keep pushing each other. This means that the history of this city isn't a straight line of progress. It's a violent cycle of construction and collapse. The ground that seems solid can, without any warning, turn liquid. And here comes the problem with those thick mud walls they took so long to build, with that inhuman physical effort. Raw brick is excellent for insulating desert heat, but it's terrible for withstanding vibration. When the earth shakes, a mud house doesn't sway like a modern steel building. It simply collapses inward. The roof, made of wooden beams and heavy layers of compacted clay, becomes an instant hydraulic press. The place you built to protect your family from the sun and thieves becomes, in a matter of seconds, the tomb of all of them. Archaeology shows layers of destruction where entire walls fell at once. But the real terror wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Today, if an earthquake happens, we turn on the television and an expert explains that the plates have settled. Back then, they didn't know what a tectonic plate or Richter scale was. For the Iron Age man, the ground opening wasn't geology, it was theology. It was a clear and terrifying sign that God, or the gods, were furious. Biblical prophets like Amos and Zechariah used earthquakes as temporal markers of divine judgment because the collective trauma was immense. You lived with the constant feeling that you were walking on eggshells, trying not to irritate the divinity that held the foundations of the earth. The instability of the ground generated mental instability. You never fully relaxed, because at any moment, the world could literally collapse on your head. When the earth shakes under your feet and disease attacks your intestine without logical explanation, the ancient human doesn't look for science to save himself. He looks for the supernatural. And it's in this moment of desperation for control that life in Jericho got really dark. As soon as the sun plunged behind the mountains of Judea, the city completely changed personality. Today, if you're afraid of the dark, you just reach out and flip a switch. Back then, night was a physical entity, heavy and absolute. The only thing separating your family from total darkness was a small clay lamp full of oil, which produced a weak and unstable flame. And keeping that light on was expensive, because oil was also food. Often, the choice was between eating or seeing. In this pitch black, human imagination filled the dark corners of the house with real terrors. Documents and inscriptions from neighboring peoples of the same era describe a constant dread of night demons, like the Lilitu, spirits that, according to them, wandered seeking to enter through open windows to cause illness or sudden death in newborns. The silence of the desert night amplified any noise. The wind hitting a door or a jackal howling far away weren't just sounds of nature. They were warnings that the spiritual world was dangerously close and active. To try to control this fear, people resorted to spiritual defense technology. When we excavate the floor of these houses, we don't just find grain pots, we find hundreds of small clay figurines, amulets, and female figures linked to fertility and protection. The Bible frequently mentions these domestic idols, and archaeology confirms they were everywhere. They weren't decorative pieces for the living room shelf. They were survival tools, strategically placed near doors and cribs as a supernatural alarm system. People were desperate to ensure that if medicine failed and the walls fell, at least the lesser gods would protect their home. This coexistence with the beyond was literal. In many periods of antiquity in this region, the dead weren't taken to distant cemeteries and forgotten like we do today. Family tombs were very close, sometimes visible from the window, or in earlier times, ancestors were buried just below the floor where the family slept. The barrier between who was alive and who had already gone was thin as a sheet of paper. You dined, worked, and slept, feeling the physical presence of past generations, hoping they would help watch over the house. They prayed fervently for this divine protection against the dangers of the night. But when the sun rose, survival depended on something much more earthly and practical. Jericho couldn't produce everything it needed alone, and to get what was missing, they were forced to open the gates to people they didn't even know. The dust that rose on the horizon at noon didn't warn about a sandstorm, but about the arrival of profit and danger. Jericho wasn't an isolated island in the middle of nowhere. It was a mandatory stop, an ancient gas station for those crossing the desert. The city produced things the world wanted, like sweet dates and a valuable medicinal balsam, but it lacked the essentials to evolve. They had no copper or tin mines to make bronze, nor the hard volcanic stone, basalt, necessary to make grain grinders that wouldn't release sand into the food. To get these technologies and stop destroying their own teeth, they needed to negotiate. But opening the gates to a foreign caravan was a game of Russian roulette. The sacred rule of hospitality in the Middle East required you to give water and bread to the traveler. But who guaranteed that merchant wasn't a spy, counting how many armed men guarded the entrance? The famous biblical story of Rahab hiding Israelite spies illustrates exactly this tension. In a city of passage, it's very easy for an enemy to enter smiling, sell a fabric, and leave with the complete map of your defenses in their head. Besides spies, these travelers brought invisible loads. Viruses and bacteria from other regions hitched a ride on the backs of camels and donkeys. When a caravan from Egypt or Mesopotamia arrived, it could bring riches. But it could also unload a new plague, for which the immune system of Jericho's residents had zero defense. Trade was vital, but it was biologically risky, and not everyone benefited from this imported wealth. Excavations reveal glaring social inequality. While some houses had bronze rings, fine pottery imported from Cyprus, and luxury seals, most neighboring dwellings had only the basics to not starve to death. There was an elite who drank wine in foreign cups, while the neighbors struggled to keep the roof standing. Wealth entered through the gates, but stayed trapped in the hands of a few. Jericho survived centuries of this tense trade routine. Wars, earthquakes, and diseases, falling and rising dozens of times. But what remains of it today? Just a mound of dry earth surrounded by tourists and cable cars, teaches us a final and harsh lesson about our own human arrogance. When you take the tourist cable car that crosses the modern city of Jericho today and look down toward the archaeological site of Tel Es-Sultan, the first reaction is usually disappointment. There are no golden palaces or gigantic gates waiting for you. What exists is a mound of dry, beige, and dusty earth, with some trenches opened by excavators like Kathleen Kenyon decades ago. It's hard for the modern brain to process that that mound of earth was the stage for some of humanity's most intense stories. That mound isn't natural. It's formed by more than 25 layers of cities destroyed and rebuilt on top of each other over 10,000 years. The Jericho of the Iron Age, where we spent all this time imagining living, is just one of those strips of pressed earth. This gives us a terrifying perspective on time. Entire empires, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Israelite armies fought, killed, and died just to control that piece of ground that today is recognized as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, but visually looks like just an abandoned hill. We usually look at these ancient peoples with a feeling of superiority or pity. We think about how their life was short, dirty, and painful without our technology. But that's the wrong view. If an inhabitant of that Jericho could see us today, he would probably find us physically pathetic. We survive because we created a protection bubble with air conditioning, treated water, and antibiotics. They survived because their body was a resistance machine that we lost. They endured viral loads that would put us in the ICU in hours. They walked distances under the 40-degree sun that would make a modern athlete faint. They built houses and irrigation channels with their own hands while feeling chronic pains that would leave us bedridden. The final lesson that the ruins of Jericho leave isn't about walls that fall, but about human stubbornness to keep standing. Living in Jericho 3,000 years ago was living at the absolute limit of what a human being can endure. It wasn't a life of daily miracles and constant divine interventions. It was a brutal routine of biological and mental resistance. The city survived earthquakes, wars, and plagues, and remains inhabited to this day. The real question isn't how they lived there, but whether we, with all our comfort and fragility, would last a week in their place. Click here on the screen to see what life was like in other cities of the Bible. But in the time when Jesus lived, click now on the video on the screen and discover fascinating secrets that aren't in the Bible.